Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the economic future of Japan and whether the narrative that has dominated the country for the past 30 plus years remains valid to this day. The common consensus about Japan is that it's a country whose best days are behind it. Its economy and its asset bubble peaked in the early 1990s, and you could see the repercussions of this in a lot of ways when it comes to Japan's financial markets, where the Nikkei has just recently made new all-time highs in the last few years after 30 years of going nowhere. Tokyo real estate is not much more expensive than the year I was born, which was over 30 years ago. And you have the yen has, on the net, appreciated considerably since the peak of Japan's boom. You've seen wages stagnate, but also you've seen purchasing power rise due to deflation, and you've seen the population peak 10 years ago and slowly decline. And Japan's economy as a percent of global GDP has also been declining considerably over that point. The real argument really for Japan is that Japan is just slowly going to die due to its demographics and its government debt load that was racked up in a response to the bust of the great Japanese boom in the late 1980s into 1990. However, there are some signs that maybe this narrative is not true, or times are changing and Japan may have more glory days in the future. First, let's just highlight some summaries about what's going on in Japan. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. I mean, depending on what you think of China's statistics, it could even be the second largest economy in the world. It is a major exporting power. Japan is still a global player in a lot of major businesses. Companies such as Sony, Nintendo, Panasonic, Honda, Hitachi, Canon, fast retailing, which is not on this graphic I'm showing you, and a variety of other Japanese companies are still major players in the global economy. The trick is, and the challenge really with Japan, is a lot of their national champions built their businesses on what is now outdated technology, like Sony on Walkmans, Brother, their most notable product internationally being printers, Canon being cameras, which there are still DSLR cameras that Canon makes that are top quality, but the demand for those has become increasingly niche in the era where you can take pictures on your phone. And yeah, that's been the challenge. So Japan has been able to adapt, and we'll get to what industries Japan has evolved into over recent years. The other thing that Japan has also become more known for is a rising tourism hub. I went to Japan about 10 years ago in 2012, and I will just show you a quick snapshot of some of my experiences. Pardon the quality of the pictures, because this was taken with an iPhone camera back in 2012 when those were not very good quality. But as you could see, my experience when I was in Japan kind of confirmed a lot of my preconceived biases over the country. If you look at just the architecture and the designs of the cars and the general vibe you get from the place, it feels like you are still in the early 1990s. In fact, I visited a friend who lived in Suwa town in Nagano at the time, and Suwa almost looked like a real-life version of Pallet Town from Pokemon. It was kind of uncannily similar. And Tokyo even still had that kind of like 1990s anime vibe. The one major thing that also stood out about my trip to Japan was when I went into the financial district to check out the Tokyo Stock Exchange and just to explore the city, I didn't see a single businessman with black hair. It was all a sea of gray, which, based on Japan's demographics, would make sense. But speaking of demographics, let's talk about demographics. Japan's population peaked in about 2010 and has been steadily declining. Japan's population, according to the Japan National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, is expected to decline from 125 million down to under 100 million by 2055, and is going to continue to decline, may fall as low as 80 million or even less by the end of the century. And it's not just the population is declining, it's that the proportion of people over 65 is going to continue to rise due to the long lifespans in the country. 2000 was really the first year where the over 65 population has exceeded the under 15 population. And due to the combination of low birth rates and longevity that is famous in the country, that gap has continued to widen. However, birth rates on an absolute basis have bottomed out in 2000. However, the number of live births continues to decline because the succeeding generations are smaller, even if the births per woman are higher. The question really I have for demographics now, though, is not necessarily whether Japan's demographics currently look bad and are on the decline, but there are two things that could actually make this demographic pyramid look positive. The first one is, if Japan is the first of the countries to have its baby boom hollow out, it will also be the first country to be past that burden and be able to build on a new footing. So if they've the first, it's like inventory management in a business. If you're the first in, it means you're going to have the first out too. So Japan could actually gain an edge ahead of a lot of other developed nations by having its pension crisis already over with when Europe and possibly North America are just getting into the heat of it. The other thing that may look constructive for Japanese demographics is that due to automation technology and robotics and AI and a variety of other advances in human capital replacement, is having a high population, particularly a high population of young people, particularly young men, an asset or a liability? Historically, it's an asset because more young people means potentially a larger military, a larger consumption base, and more workers to produce things. However, if the ability of production becomes uncorrelated with the labor supply and the amount of population, then maybe having less people, but having more services produced by the machinery and the software built by those people will result in higher standards of living, and less people to take care of maybe means more surplus to be invested into either furthering advancing that technology or being able to project power outside of Japan's borders. That's some food for thought for those who always say that a rising and fast-growing young population is always good. If you think that's the case, then India has the best future of any country. If you think that maybe that the advancements in AI and technology may change that dynamic, maybe Japan is a country with a very bright future. Another real strength really of Japan has changed is affordable housing. This has been one of the other consequences of a declining population. When you have, let's just say, the same amount of housing stock, but less people to occupy them, that will reduce the demand of housing and keep the supply the same, and therefore prices will fall. But it's not even that. Japan has been successful in actually building more housing on the net. If you look at this chart here, the annualized production of housing in Japan has been well over 1.5% of the city per year in Greater Tokyo, whereas in the other major world cities of similar importance, Paris, London, and New York, it's less than half of that, and it's even as low as a third of that. In New York, it's just 0.5%. And in California, like in LA and San Francisco, it's probably even less due to all the NIMBY restrictions. So Japan has been able to, due to a more constructive housing policy, I guess there's a little bit of a pun intended there, has been able to keep housing affordable, and so therefore Japanese citizens have more disposable income to spend on other things, and that's what keeps their economy floated. And it's also why inflation is a lot lower in Japan than other countries, because if you look at the CPI index in the US or similar inflation measures in other developed nations, housing is a large chunk of them, and housing prices are going up much faster, whether it's rents or outright real estate sales prices have been going up much faster during the post-COVID recovery in those places than they have in Japan. Uh, and so as a result, Japan's inflation is now just crossing 4%, whereas Western countries' inflation peaked over 9%. And I think that is the main difference, is that has to do with housing. And that's even with the fact that Japan has to import nearly all of its energy and a big chunk of its food. However, with all the good things going Japan, there is the big elephant in the room, and that is debt. Japan has the highest amount of government debt of any country relative to GDP at over 250%. As a result of this, the BOJ has had to hold rates extremely low, actually outright negative, for several years, because if interest rates go a little bit above 1% on the 10-year yield of the JGB, Japan may be at risk of bankruptcy because interest expenses would be greater than their discretionary spending if they had to actually pay a positive real interest rate or even a positive nominal interest rate. Like back when Japanese interest rates were in this like 0.5% and the debt was slightly lower, interest expense was already 25% of Japan's expenses. So I can't imagine with the higher levels of debt now and the risk of having to raise inflation, or interest rates higher because of inflation, it's an even bigger issue now. And I don't really think Japan will necessarily default, but the risk really for Japan is they just let their currency fail or just get extremely weak as a means to inflate away the debt. And we kind of saw this a little bit with the way that the dollar-yen currency pair traded in 2022. The yen has stabilized somewhat after the Bank of Japan widened its peg on the 10-year JGB and allowed rates to turn positive. But if the market starts to sniff the end game of the debt, and if Japan can't keep its economy humming and maintain productivity in the face of its government debt problems, then this has the potential to explode. So how is Japan dealing with this demographic and debt problem? Well, I would call it the automation nation. Japan has been the leading company to embrace robotics technology, and Japan has been forced to do this just due to a lot of political and demographic variables that are forcing their hand. First, Japan's population is rapidly aging, and the younger cohorts are smaller than the retired cohorts. So they just simply don't have as much people to do the same amount of work that needs to be done. And so they're going to need technological assistance to do it. Second thing is, a lot of multinational companies in Japan are looking to expand their operations overseas and do not have enough people in the home country to help do that. They do some hiring locally, but automation also helps with needing less people in the home country to manage the overseas divisions of their multinationals. Another component of this is Japan historically has some of the lowest labor productivity rate in the OECD. And because of that, the cost of switching away from an unproductive worker to using software or machinery is much lower than in other countries where workers are more productive, such as the United States. And then there's also just simply the population going down as a lot of these elderly people in Japan decline. And so in order to maintain the same level of services and with less people, you're going to need more automation. And then the last part is the cultural stigma against immigration in Japan, which is how other countries in the world have tried to solve their demographic problems. Instead of bringing in immigrants from other countries, Japan has instead tried to become more productive and use the assistance of technology to maintain the labor output without increasing the labor supply from overseas. And let's see, how has the robotic revolution done so far for Japan? Well, 5 of the top 10 robotics companies in the world are based in Japan. The top 2 industrial robotics companies in Japan, FANUC and Yaskawa, alone account for 29.5% of the global industrial robotics market alone. And they have other leading robotics companies that are based in Japan. And they include Kawasaki, Yaskawa that I mentioned before, Daifuku, SMC, and then FANUC, which I also mentioned before. So Japan is, and Mitsubishi has a robotics division too. Japan is a major player in that. Japan has also been working on remilitarizing its country and increasing defense spending. And a lot of the R&D efforts on that have been focusing on automating vehicles and using robotics technology to make up for the relative lack of manpower Japan has compared to some of its geopolitical rivals, such as China. And then I mentioned before, Japan has relatively low labor productivity, so the opportunity cost of shifting to robotics is not as bad as in other places. And as a lot of you like when I do with this video series, is I like to compare the countries I talk about to regions in the United States. And Japan is too big of an economy to be compared to a single state. So instead, I compared Japan to the entire west coast of the United States. And for this reference, I am referring to California, Oregon, and Washington. So like the 48 continental states, lower 48 continental states of the Pacific Ocean. And if you look at their population, Japan has more than double the population at 124.8 million, whereas the west coast of the United States has 51 million. However, in nominal terms at least, the west coast of the United States has a GDP bigger than Japan at 4.66 trillion versus 4.3 trillion. Japan's PPP adjusted one is 6.1 trillion, but as I've said before, I tend not to trust PPP numbers because I find it hard to believe that the cost of living in Tokyo is that much lower than rural Indiana, even though 40% of Japan's population lives in Greater Tokyo. The GDP per capita nominally is much higher in the West Coast, in California, Oregon, and Washington, which are some of the wealthier states in the United States. The average income is $85,667, whereas in Japan, it's $34,357. Japan is beating the West Coast in Fortune 500 companies. In the global Fortune 500, Japan has 45 companies, whereas the West Coast of the U.S. just has 17. And what is particularly damning is that Los Angeles only has one, and San Diego only has one. Like, they're mainly concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area and Seattle. And the reason for this is because the West Coast has a relatively unfriendly business environment, especially if you are not a technology or media company. So a lot of the businesses that used to be based in places such as Southern California have migrated to Texas and other more business-friendly locations. If it wasn't for that, the West Coast would probably have the same amount of Fortune 500 companies, if not more than Japan. However, there's really no Japanese version of Texas for the Japanese companies to move to. The other big difference also is just how each local culture views immigration. The West Coast is known for being one of the most pro-immigration places in the world, particularly the San Francisco Bay Area. And the result is that you have 23% of the West Coast population being foreign-born. And in California particularly, it's 26.6. When it comes to Japan, however, is one of the least tolerant of immigration of any developed nation in the world. They only have 2.4% of their population foreign-born, which is historically very high. Most of Japan's history, that number is 1% or less. In terms of net exports, 23% of Japan's GDP is through exports, whereas in the West Coast of the U.S., that's really more only like 7% of GDP is exports. Both regions also are global leaders in video game development, robotics, entertainment. It's not a coincidence how the popularity of anime is due to how well Japan has been able to market its culture overseas. And yeah, the West Coast of the US is where Microsoft and Electronic Arts and Activision Blizzard, which are the primarily big United States based video game developers, are all situated in the West. Whereas in Japan, you've got Sony, Nintendo, Capcom, Square Enix. There's lots of them. And so these are kind of the two hubs for the gaming industry. Another fun fact, really, about Japan versus the West Coast is in the late 1980s, the peak of the Japan bubble, the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo had more value than all of the property for sale in California, which shows you kind of how crazy the Japan speculative mania was back then. Overall, these are very different cultures, but there's also some surprising similarities. Even just looking at the map, like from all the way from Hokkaido to the north to I think Kyushu is the furthest south island in Japan. The southern edge of that is the same distance almost as the Canadian border to San Diego on the U.S. West Coast. Japan stretches a little bit farther due to outward islands such as Okinawa, but among the main core islands of Japan, north to south is the same distance effectively as north to south in the west coast of America. Overall, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic on Japan than the consensus. They have their big problem with debt, and demographics are going to be a challenge, but I think they've stepped up to the challenge in a way of being able to adapt and become a power in building labor-saving technology, particularly robotics, as their way to become viable. And it'll be interesting to see if the first mover advantage of moving through the baby boom demographic bulge will be an asset for Japan or a liability. If you like more of this content, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you guys all for watching.